Welcome back. Part 2 of this chapter, and we're going to finish talking about World War I and what it looked like inside of the United States. The war to end war, as it was called, or later called the Great War. If war can be great. Do you think war can be great? Well, it was called the Great War, and then later called World War I. So we look at this first slide, and we're going to talk about some of the politics of this. In World War I in America. Now, the Espionage Act of 1917. Now, what is espionage? We get a word from this. It's a French word, and we get a word from this, a short three-letter word, espionage. And the word that we get from that is spy or spy. So if you're a spy, you're trying to get information on another country. And of course, no country wants its own people to be spying on their own country. And so the United States is no exception, and passed what was called the Espionage Act of June of 1917. And the Sedition Act, or the Sedition Amendment to the Espionage Act, was also passed. And basically, this meant that you couldn't criticize the government for saying disloyal, profane, or scurrilous or abusive language. You could not criticize the president. You could not suggest that people should not join the draft. And you had to be quiet if you didn't agree with the government. Now today, that kind of idea is very controversial in the United States. We don't generally think that the government should prevent us from saying something about the government. But every now and then we do have laws like this that we've passed. World War I is no exception. During the Civil War we did. And during the quasi-wars with France in 1798, we also had these. And one of the ways that we could generate support for this war, other than stopping people from saying bad things about the United States government, one way was to say bad things about the German government. If we look at the next slide, we can see, destroy this mad brute. So the girl, poor, innocent, beautiful girl. This is the American value. But the brute with the stick, this was Germany. And that's how we tried to portray, or how we did portray, the German government and the enemy. Now, at the next slide, we see censorship. We see the American Protective League. Half of U.S. states banned speaking German in school, so you were not allowed to speak the German language in school. In some places, you couldn't speak German even over the telephone. If someone heard you on the phone and you were speaking German, it was against the law. Not in the entire country. Mail was opened if it was coming from some place where the government believed that it may be suspicious. They would open mail and read it. And in 1919, there was a court case in, remember, SCOTUS, Supreme Court of the United States, or we just say the Supreme Court. There was a court case called Schenck versus the United States, and out of this court case came the ability for the United States government to limit your free speech. So you think you can say anything you want in this country, but in fact, there's some things that you can't say. If your words present a clear and present danger to the security of the United States can stop that free speech. There is a saying that we have in Latin, and it's called inter armis silence leges, and it means in times of war, the law is silent. And this idea of in times of war, the law is silent, is the notion that we have these really great ideas and we put them into our documents like the Constitution. And we say that these are American values or whatever values for whatever country you're in. But in times of war, we don't always adhere to the laws that we have in place to protect people. And so we say in times of war, the laws are silent, meaning you're not always protected by the laws in times of war. So in the next slide, we can see World War I in America, and total deaths of the World War as a total would be about 15 to 18 million people. Now, it's not anywhere near as what we have in World War II, but we have a lot of people, 15 to 18 million people. The Allies, UK, or Britain, France, Russia, Italy, they lose the most. More than 1 million for each of them. Russia loses between 2 and 3 million. And they're also on the side of the Allies initially, but when the United States gets involved in the war, they get out of the war. The U.S. lost 117,000 men. And the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Empire, they lost about 2 million each. And so quite a few that they lost. At the end of the war, there's something called the Treaty of Versailles. And the Treaty of Versailles is really important because what the Treaty of Versailles does is sets up, not on purpose, of course, not intentionally, but sets up the world for World War II. And so this is what President Woodrow Wilson wants in the Treaty of Versailles. He has these 14 points. And I don't have all 14 here. You don't need to know all 14. But I want to mention several here. One is he wants an end to secret diplomacy. Government should not be able to secretly communicate. Of course, we know that they do today. A reduction of arms, smaller militaries. Open seas, meaning no one country can control the oceans. Reduction of trade barriers, meaning we don't have a lot of taxes for one country and no taxes for another, or a lot of taxes for every country. We want to reduce trade barriers. We want to have fair treatment of colonies, because we can't treat the colonies differently than we treat the mother country. We have to treat them equally, not differently. We want to return all land that Germany took during World War I. And 8 points of the 14 points had to do with this. And we also create the League of Nations, which is like the United Nations today. Now, as part of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was forced to give up territory that it won in the war. It has to give it back to wherever it took it from, including from France. It has to surrender control of mining territory, and this now goes to France for 15 years. It has to give back territory that had acquired in treaties 40 years prior to World War I. And Germany also surrendered all colonies, parts of China, parts of Samoa and Guinea in the Pacific, and 4 colonies in Africa, the Caroline, Mariana, and the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. So they gave up a lot of territory. So they felt that they had been punished severely. And in fact, they were punished severely. On the next slide, we can see a map of Europe after World War I, and we can see some of these territories that that Germany was forced to give back to the countries around it that it had taken during the war and in the 40 years prior to the war. And the brown is what ultimately Germany is left with. Now, what about Germany's military? Well, on the next slide, we see that they cannot have an army of more than 100,000 men. They cannot have frontier military fortifications at all, meaning any fortifications on the border between between Germany and France, or between Germany and now Poland, or Germany and any other countries. They cannot have any fortifications. Have to limit on the type of weapons that they can have, and they can have no chemical weapons, and they can have no tanks. And they can have only a small navy. They can have no submarines and not more than 15,000 men in their navy. No large ships in the navy. And if they had large ships and those ships were decommissioned and either used by other countries or used for other purposes or sunk or destroyed, and they could have no air force. And so their military was made to be very small. Now, on the next slide, we can see that the reparations, they also have to pay back England and France for all the money that the damage that they had caused. They had to pay, they agreed to pay $64 billion. Today it's $790 billion. That's a lot of money. Now, much of this was just so that the people, the leaders of the countries at the Treaty of Versailles in Paris, France, can go back home and say, look what we did to Germany. They have to pay us so much money. In fact, when Germany stopped paying it, they had paid very little amount of that $64 billion. And they took loans from American bankers. The American bankers gave them loans, and Germany would develop industry, and they would use that to pay back England and France, or they would use that money to pay back England and France. And so over time, the Germans slowed that payment, and when Hitler comes into power in the early 1930s, he almost immediately cuts off payments as a result of the Treaty of Versailles. And we'll talk more about that when we get to World War II. But if you look at the next slide, you can see President Wilson comes back to the United States, and he claims now the world knows that the United States is the savior of the world. Now, how arrogant is that for an American president to say that we are the savior of the world? How arrogant. But in fact, in this case, in World War I, if the United States had not fought in World War I, or if someone had not fought in World War I and helped save the Allies, all of Germany today would probably be speaking German, which maybe isn't a bad thing today. Of course, anyone in Europe will say it's a bad thing, but we're now 100 years later. And if we were now 100 years later, maybe we don't think it's bad. And so there's very clever and complicated how history kind of shifts and changes, and how we don't know what's going to happen. But this included in the Treaty of Versailles was the new League of Nations. And the idea was that there should be collective security, meaning people would work together to secure the safety of the world, not alliances between only 2 or 3 countries. But the United States doesn't join the League of Nations because that's something the Senate has to do. And the Senate did not like President Wilson, so they would not sign the United States into the League of Nations. And so that's the end of World War I with the League of Nations, and President Wilson cannot get us into it. And in 1920, President Wilson leaves office, and we're going to talk more about the progressive amendments that take place during his time as president in the next chapter. And then we're going to move on to the 1920s. It's called the Roaring Twenties. See you guys then. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.